The English Channel churned with unprecedented fury on the night of June 4th, 1944, as if nature itself sought to prevent the largest seaborne invasion in human history. General Dwight David Eisenhower stood before the rain-streaked windows of Southwick House, his weathered face reflecting the weight of decision that would determine the fate of Western civilization. Behind him, the Supreme Allied Command buzzed with tension as meteorologists delivered their grim assessment. Winds reaching 35 miles per hour, waves cresting at 6 feet, and visibility reduced to mere yards. Operation Overlord, the code name for the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, had been meticulously planned for over 2 years. 156,000 Allied troops waited aboard nearly 7,000 vessels, their stomachs churning not just from seasickness, but from the knowledge that they were about to assault Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall of fortress of concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and machine gun nests stretching along the French coastline. The decision to postpone the invasion from June 5th had been agonizing. The tides, moon phases, and daylight hours would not align again for another month, giving the Germans precious time to strengthen their defenses. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who now commanded Army Group B defending the French coast, had spent months transforming the beaches into killing fields. His Rommel's asparagus, wooden stakes topped with mines-dotted potential landing zones, while underwater obstacles awaited the Allied landing craft. Group Captain James Martin Stagg, the chief meteorologist, approached Eisenhower with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. His weather team had detected a brief window of improvement. Beginning June 6, not ideal conditions, but perhaps sufficient for the greatest gamble of the war. The winds would drop to 15 miles per hour, the clouds would lift slightly, and the seas would calm just enough for the massive armada to make its approach. As documented in Stephen Ambrose's D-Day, June 6, 1944, Eisenhower faced an impossible choice between waiting for perfect conditions that might never come and seizing an imperfect moment that could still determine victory or catastrophe for the Allied cause. The Supreme Commander's mind raced through the countless variables that had brought them to this moment. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception campaign, had successfully convinced the German High Command that the main invasion would strike at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. General George Smith Patton, Jr., commanding the fictional 1st United States Army Group, had played his role perfectly, making public appearances in England opposite the narrowest part of the channel while the real invasion force assembled elsewhere. Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, had spent months studying intelligence reports about the German defenders. The Wehrmacht's 7th Army, under Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, was spread thin along hundreds of miles of coastline. Many of the troops were either green recruits or battle-weary veterans of the Eastern Front, a far cry from the elite panzer divisions held in reserve. At precisely 21 hours and 15 minutes on June 4th, Eisenhower made his decision. "I am quite positive we must give the order," he declared to his assembled commanders. "I don't like it, but there it is. I don't see how we can possibly do anything else." The invasion would proceed on June 6th, despite the marginal weather conditions. As word spread through the vast military machine, 175,000 men began final preparations for the assault that would open the Second Front in Europe. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions applied war paint to their faces, while Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces crews conducted final briefings for the largest aerial armada ever assembled. The die was cast. In less than 12 hours, the fate of Nazi Germany and indeed the world would hang in the balance on the beaches of Normandy. The storm clouds gathering over the English Channel seemed almost prophetic, heralding not just meteorological turbulence, but the tempest of battle that would forever change the course of history. At precisely 23 hours and 51 minutes on June 5, 1944, the roar of 1,300 transport aircraft filled the night sky over southern England. Inside the cramped fuselages of Douglas Charlie 4-7 Skytrains and converted bombers, American and British paratroopers made final checks of their equipment, many carrying over 100 pounds of gear strapped to their bodies. The airborne assault, the opening movement of Operation Overlord, was about to begin. Major Richard Dick Winters of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company, felt the familiar pre-combat tension. As his aircraft crossed the English Channel, the 24th hour approached, marking the official beginning of June 6th and D-Day itself. Around him, his men sat in focused silence, their blackened faces betraying none of the fear that gnawed at every soldier's gut. The German flag began at precisely 0 hours and 15 minutes. Orange tracer rounds streaking through the darkness like deadly fireworks. Anti-aircraft guns of the Wehrmacht's 7th Army had detected the massive air armada, but Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann's headquarters initially dismissed the flights as another bombing mission against targets deeper in France. This crucial misunderstanding would cost the defenders precious minutes of preparation. Flight Lieutenant David Lord, piloting a short Sterling bomber carrying British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, wrestled with his controls as flak burst around his aircraft. His mission was to deliver his human cargo to Drop Zone November, east of the Orne River, where Major John Howard's Glatterborn Coup de main force would attempt to capture the vital Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge. The chaos began immediately. Heavy cloud cover, combined with German anti-aircraft fire, scattered the carefully planned formations. Transport pilots, many on their first combat mission, found themselves flying blind through the Norman countryside, desperately searching for landmarks that matched their brief drop zones. The result was catastrophic dispersion instead of landing in concentrated groups. The paratroopers were scattered across hundreds of square miles of enemy territory. Private James Blue Alley of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment found himself dangling from his parachute in the bell tower of St. Mère-Église, a small Norman village that would become synonymous with D-Day legend. Below him, German soldiers of the 91st Air Landing Division raced through streets littered with the debris of misdropped equipment bundles. The town's church bell tolled midnight as if announcing the beginning of liberation or doom. Major General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, had planned for his paratroopers to secure key crossroads and causeways behind Utah Beach. Instead, his scattered units found themselves engaged in dozens of small unit actions across the Cotentin Peninsula. Brigadier General James Maurice Gavin, leading the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed miles from his intended drop zone and spent the early morning hours gathering scattered paratroopers using cricket calls and password challenges. The British 6th Airborne Division, under Major General Richard Nelson Gale, faced equally daunting challenges. Their mission to secure the eastern flank of the invasion required capturing key bridges and destroying others to prevent German counterattacks. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway's 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment was tasked with neutralizing the heavily fortified Merville Battery, whose guns could rake Sword Beach with devastating fire. Despite the chaos, small miracles began emerging from the darkness. Major Howard's glider assault on Pegasus Bridge succeeded brilliantly when 3 Horsa gliders landed within yards of their target. The Coup de main force overwhelmed the surprised German garrison in a matter of minutes, securing the first objective of D-Day. As dawn approached, the scattered paratroopers began accomplishing their missions through sheer determination and improvisation. Though few units had landed where planned, their presence behind German lines created confusion and prevented the coordinated response that might have thrown the seaborne invasion back into the channel. The airborne assault, despite its apparent chaos, was achieving its strategic purpose, disrupting German communications and preventing reinforcements from reaching the beaches where, in just a few hours, the greatest amphibious assault in history would commence. At 05 hours and 50 minutes on June 6, 1944, the horizon erupted in volcanic fury as the largest naval bombardment in history commenced. 7 battleships, 18 cruisers, and 43 destroyers of the Allied naval forces opened fire simultaneously, their guns ranging from 5-inch destroyer cannons to the massive 16-inch rifles of the battleship USS Texas. The thunder of naval gunfire rolled across the English Channel like an approaching storm, announcing to Hitler's Atlantic Wall that its hour of reckoning had arrived. Admiral Sir Bertram Home Ramsay, commanding the Allied naval forces, had orchestrated this maritime symphony of destruction from his flagship HMS Bilolo. The Eastern Task Force under Rear Admiral Sir Philip Louis Vian would support the British and Canadian landings at Sword, Juno, and Gold Beaches, while the Western Task Force under Rear Admiral Alan Goodrich Kirk covered the American assault on Omaha and Utah beaches aboard the battleship HMS Warspite, veteran of both world wars. Gun crews loaded and fired their 15-inch shells in mechanical precision. Each projectile weighed nearly 1 ton and could penetrate 6 feet of reinforced concrete. The ship's gunnery officer, Commander James Wallace, coordinated fire with Royal Air Force spotting aircraft that circled above the Norman coastline. Directing the devastating barrage onto German strongpoints, the German defenders had never experienced anything approaching this scale of bombardment. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Meyer, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division's coastal positions, watched in horrified fascination as his carefully constructed bunkers disappeared under the relentless pounding. Communications lines severed, observation posts obliterated, and entire sections of the Atlantic Wall reduced to rubble and smoking craters dotted Point du Hoc. The massive concrete casemates housing German 155mm guns became primary targets for the USS Satterlee and HMS Taliban. The Allied commanders knew these weapons could devastate the landing forces on both Omaha and Utah beaches if left operational. The bombardment was so intense that Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rutter's 2nd Ranger Battalion, tasked with scaling the 100-foot cliffs to capture the position, would later find the German guns had already been moved inland. The naval gunfire was precisely timed to lift and shift targets. As the first wave of landing craft approached the beaches, coxswains of the landing craft vehicle personnel strained to see through the smoke and spray as they navigated toward their assigned sectors. Seasickness plagued many of the assault troops, weakened further by their pre-dawn breakfast of coffee, sandwiches, and seasickness pills that proved largely ineffective in the rough seas. Major General Leonard Townsend Jarrow's 5th Corps, approaching Omaha Beach, faced the most daunting prospect. Intelligence had failed to identify the presence of the veteran 352nd Infantry Division, which had recently moved into positions overlooking the beach. Colonel Dietrich Krase, the division commander, had spent months perfecting interlocking fields of fire from his machine gun nests and mortar positions. As referenced in Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day, the German coastal defenders initially believed the bombardment might be another diversionary attack, as the Allied deception operations had successfully convinced many Wehrmacht officers that the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais. The preliminary aerial bombardment by the 8th Air Force had proven less effective than hoped. Flying through heavy cloud cover, many B-24 Liberator and B-17 Flying Fortress bombers had delayed their bomb release to avoid hitting the approaching Allied landing craft. Consequently, most of their ordnance fell harmlessly inland, leaving the beach defenses largely intact. At 06 hours and 30 minutes, the naval gunfire began lifting from the beaches to targets further inland. The sudden silence that followed seemed almost deafening after the continuous thunder of the bombardment. Landing craft coxswains gunned their engines for the final approach, knowing that within minutes, 156,000 Allied soldiers would begin the most crucial battle of the Second World War. The die was cast, the naval bombardment complete. Now everything depended on the courage of individual soldiers, who would have to cross several hundred yards of killing ground to establish the foothold that would begin the liberation of Western Europe. At 06 hours and 30 minutes on June 6, 1944, the first wave of American assault troops approached the 5-mile stretch of Norman coastline, codenamed Omaha Beach. What followed in the next 6 hours would become synonymous with both the horror of modern warfare and the extraordinary courage of ordinary men. The beach that planners had expected to be secured by noon nearly became the graveyard of Operation Overlord. Colonel George Arthur Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, watched from his command craft as the first landing craft vehicle personnel ground onto the sand at 06 hours and 35 minutes. The men of Companies A, E, F, and G of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, waded into chest-deep water, carrying 60 pounds of equipment each. Within seconds, the carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos. The German 352nd Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Dietrich Krase, had transformed Omaha Beach into a killing field of interlocking machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery from their positions atop the 100-foot bluffs. Wehrmacht soldiers commanded perfect fields of fire across the beach. The preliminary bombardment had barely scratched their deep concrete bunkers and reinforced positions. Company A of the 116th Infantry suffered 96% casualties. In the first 30 minutes, Captain Taylor Fellers watched helplessly as his men were cut down before they could cross the high water mark. Machine gun nests positioned in the Vierville draw raked the beach with MG-40 to span out fire at 1,200 rounds per minute, creating what survivors would later describe as a curtain of death. Sergeant First Class Philip Strechik of the 2nd Ranger Battalion found himself pinned behind a steel beach obstacle. as German artillery zeroed in on the landing craft still approaching the shore. The tide was rising, threatening to drown wounded men who couldn't move from the water's edge. Bodies bobbed face down in the surf, their life preservers keeping them afloat in death as they had failed to do in life. The disaster at Omaha Beach threatened the entire invasion. Lieutenant General Omar Nelson Bradley, commanding the First Army from the cruiser USS Augusta, received increasingly desperate radio messages from the beach. Casualties heavy, cannot advance inland, request immediate. Naval gunfire support crackled through the static-filled communications. The carefully planned timetable was collapsing. Colonel Charles Draper Wharton Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment was wounded twice, but continued moving among his men, shouting above the din of battle, "They're murdering us here. Let's move inland and get murdered." His dark humor reflected the desperate situation facing the assault forces, trapped between the rising tide and the murderous fire from the bluffs. Captain John Robert Spaulding of Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment, led one of the first successful penetrations of the German defenses with only a handful of men. He found a weak spot in the wire obstacles and began the tortuous climb up the bluff face. This small breakthrough would eventually become the crack that split open the German defense. The situation grew so desperate that Admiral Alan Goodrich Kirk ordered destroyers to close within 1,000 yards of the beach, risking grounding in the shallow water. The USS McCook, USS Carmack, and USS Doyle provided point-blank fire support, their 5-inch guns systematically destroying German positions that had survived the earlier bombardment. As documented in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive study of D-Day, the turning point came when small groups of junior officers and non-commissioned officers began leading individual assaults up the bluffs, often without orders from higher command. By noon, Colonel Taylor's famous words had become the rallying cry for the survivors. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach: the dead and those who are going to die now. Let's get the hell out of here." Slowly, painfully, the American forces began climbing the bluffs, using Bangalore torpedoes to clear wire obstacles and grenades to silence machine gun nests. The price was horrific: over 1,000 casualties in the first 6 hours. But by nightfall, the Americans had established a precarious foothold 6 miles wide and barely a mile deep. Omaha Beach had nearly failed, but the courage of individual soldiers had prevented disaster, while American forces struggled desperately. At Omaha Beach, the British and Canadian assault forces were achieving remarkable success along their assigned sectors of the Norman coastline. At 07 hours and 25 minutes on June 6, 1944, the first wave of British troops from the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division stormed ashore at Gold Beach with a precision and effectiveness that vindicated years of meticulous planning and training. Major General Douglas Alexander Graham, commanding the 50th Division, had learned valuable lessons from the disastrous Dieppe raid of 1942. His forces would advance behind a creeping barrage of artillery fire, supported by specialized armor, including Churchill Crocodile flamethrowing tanks and Aver armored vehicle Royal Engineers, equipped with petard mortars for destroying concrete fortifications. The German defenders at Gold Beach, primarily elements of the 716th Infantry Division, under Lieutenant General Wilhelm Richter, were overwhelmed by the coordination between British naval gunfire, Royal Air Force close air support, and the innovative funnies of Major General Sir Percy Cleghorn Stanley Hobart's 79th Armored Division. DD duplex drive Sherman tanks, swimming ashore under their own power, provided immediate armored support that had been tragically absent at Omaha. Lieutenant Colonel Robin Hastings McNair of the Green Howards led his battalion across the beach at La Hamel with textbook precision. The preliminary bombardment had been far more effective here than at the American sectors, with German strongpoints methodically destroyed by naval gunfire, directed by Royal Navy spotting teams. By 09 hours, his men had cleared the beach obstacles and were advancing inland toward their D-Day objectives. At Juno Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General Rodney Frederick Leopold Keller faced perhaps the most challenging assault of all the British sectors. The beach was heavily mined and defended by elements of the 716th Infantry Division, with concrete bunkers and machine gun nests commanding every approach. The Canadian assault began 40 minutes behind schedule due to rough seas, but this delay proved fortunate as it allowed the naval bombardment additional time to soften German defenses. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, and Regiment de la Chaudière led the assault with characteristic Canadian determination. Sergeant Major Stanley Hollis of the Green Howards earned the only Victoria Cross awarded on D-Day for his single-handed assault onto German machine gun positions at Gold Beach, demonstrating the individual heroism that complemented the tactical success. As documented in Max Hastings' Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle for Normandy, the success at the British beaches stemmed largely from superior tactical coordination and the effective use of specialized equipment developed specifically for amphibious warfare. Sword Beach, the easternmost Allied landing, was assigned to the 3rd British Infantry Division commanded by Major General Tom Rennie. Their mission was perhaps the most ambitious of D-Day, to advance 12 miles inland and capture the city of Caen by nightfall. The Staffordshire Yeomanry, equipped with D.D. Sherman tanks, provided crucial fire support as infantry battalions of the South Lancashire Regiment and East Yorkshire Regiment established their beachhead. The German response at Sword Beach came primarily from the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division. Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bernikowski launched the only significant German armored counterattack of D-Day, pushing his mark for tanks and assault guns toward the beach. At approximately 16 hours, however, the attack lacked coordination and was repelled by British anti-tank guns and naval gunfire from HMS Warspite. By 18 hours on June 6th, British and Canadian forces had achieved most of their D-Day objectives. The 50th Division had advanced 6 miles inland from Gold Beach, linking up with American forces advancing from Omaha. The Canadians at Juneau had penetrated deeper inland than any other Allied force, with reconnaissance elements approaching within sight of Caen's outskirts. The 3rd Division at Sword Beach had established a solid beachhead and connected with the airborne forces holding Pegasus Bridge. Though Caen itself remained in German hands, the strategic situation was entirely favorable to the Allies. Unlike the desperate struggle at Omaha, the British beaches had become highways for reinforcement and resupply. The success of Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches proved that the lessons learned from earlier amphibious operations, combined with overwhelming firepower and innovative technology, could overcome even the strongest coastal defenses. The Second Front in Europe was now firmly established. At the westernmost edge of the Allied invasion, Utah Beach presented a deceptively quiet introduction to the Norman coastline. At 06 hours and 30 minutes on June 6, 1944, the 4th Infantry Division under Major General Raymond Oscar Barton began their assault on what would prove to be the most successful of all 5 D-Day landing beaches. The irony was not lost on the planners. Utah Beach had been added to the invasion plan at the last minute, and its remarkable success would vindicate that crucial decision. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president and assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division, was the oldest man to land on D-Day at 56 years of age. Despite suffering from arthritis and heart problems, Roosevelt had personally requested to accompany the first wave, becoming the only general officer to land with the initial assault forces. His walking stick had become as famous as his courage among the men of the 4th Division. The first wave of landing craft approached the Norman shore through relatively calm waters, a stark contrast to the nightmare unfolding simultaneously at Omaha Beach 20 miles to the east. The German defenders of Utah Beach consisted primarily of second-rate troops from the 709th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben. Many were either very young conscripts or older reservists, with a significant number of foreign volunteers and conscripts from occupied territories. The preliminary bombardment had been devastatingly effective at Utah. The battleship USS Nevada, veteran of Pearl Harbor, had methodically destroyed German strongpoints with her 14-inch guns. The 460-pound shells had collapsed bunkers and severed communication lines, leaving the defenders stunned and disoriented when the first Americans waded ashore. Colonel Van Fleet's 8th Infantry Regiment touched down at 06 hours and 35 minutes, but strong currents had carried the landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended target. Instead of landing opposite the heavily fortified Tarry Green sector, they found themselves facing a lightly defended stretch of beach near St. Marie-Dumont. Roosevelt, surveying the situation with his characteristic calm, made the decision that would define the Utah Beach assault. We'll start the war from right here. The German resistance at Utah Beach was sporadic and poorly coordinated. The coastal defense positions had been designed to repel an attack at the planned landing sites. not the accidental location where the Americans actually came ashore. Machine gun nests and artillery positions found themselves out of position to deliver effective fire, while the American infantry quickly exploited gaps in the defensive line. Private Charles Norman Shea of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade worked frantically to clear beach obstacles while under sporadic rifle fire from German positions. The contrast with Omaha Beach was striking. At Utah, engineers could work methodically to clear paths through the obstacles, while naval gunfire systematically eliminated resistance. By 08 hours, landing craft were arriving in regular waves, disgorging men and equipment with minimal casualties. As documented in Gordon Harrison's official Army history cross-channel attack, the success at Utah Beach was due to a combination of factors: effective preliminary bombardment, the accidental landing at a weakly defended location, aggressive leadership by junior officers, and the rapid link-up with airborne forces inland. The connection with the scattered paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions became the crucial next phase of the Utah Beach operation. Lieutenant Colonel Robert George Cole of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment had spent the night gathering scattered paratroopers near St. Mire-Église, while elements of the 82nd Airborne held key causeways leading inland from the beach. By noon on June 6th, the 4th Infantry Division had advanced for miles inland and established contact with paratroop units at several locations. The casualties at Utah Beach were remarkably fewer than 200. Killed, wounded, and missing out of over 23,000 men landed on the first day. This success rate of less than 1% casualties was unprecedented in amphibious warfare. The triumph at Utah Beach provided the Allied command with crucial flexibility. The secure beachhead allowed for the rapid buildup of forces that would eventually cut off the Cotentin Peninsula and capture the vital port of Cherbourg. Roosevelt's split-second decision to start the war from right here had turned a navigational error into strategic victory. As the sun set on June 6, 1944, the greatest gamble in military history has succeeded beyond the most optimistic Allied projections. Despite the near disaster at Omaha Beach and the scattered airborne landings, 156,000 Allied soldiers had established 5 separate beachheads along 60 miles of Norman coastline. The Second Front in Europe was now an irreversible reality, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. General Dwight David Eisenhower, who had spent the day at his advance headquarters at Portsmouth monitoring reports from the beaches, finally allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The message he had drafted in case of failure accepting full responsibility for the defeat remained undelivered in his wallet. Instead, he began planning the rapid expansion of the Normandy foothold into the launching pad for the liberation of Western Europe. The German response to the landings had been fatally delayed by their own command structure and the success of Allied deception operations. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, while Adolf Hitler slept late at his Berghof retreat and refused to be awakened with news of the invasion. The crucial panzer reserves remained paralyzed by the requirement for Hitler's personal authorization before deployment, a delay that cost the Wehrmacht its best chance to throw the Allies back into the Channel. Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding the German 7th Army, had finally recognized the scale of the Allied assault by mid-morning, but his efforts to coordinate a counterattack were hampered by severed communications and the absence of senior commanders. The 21st Panzer Division's attack at Sword Beach represented the only significant armored response of the day, and it had been easily repelled by British anti-tank defenses and naval gunfire. The statistics of D-Day's success were impressive by any measure, despite fears of casualties approaching 50% at some beaches. Total Allied losses numbered approximately 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing, still a heavy price, but far below the catastrophic projections that had haunted invasion planners. The German defenders had lost approximately 4,000 to 6,000 men, including many irreplaceable veterans and officers. More importantly, the logistical triumph of D-Day had begun immediately. By midnight on June 6th, over 6,000 vehicles had been landed, along with hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel. The prefabricated Mulberry harbors would soon begin arriving to provide port facilities, while the Pluto pipeline under the ocean would eventually deliver fuel directly from England to the Normandy beachhead. The success of D-Day stemmed from multiple factors that historians would analyze for decades afterward. The weather decision, despite its risks, had caught the Germans completely off guard. Many commanders believed the rough seas made invasion impossible and had left their posts for exercises or personal business. The elaborate deception operations had convinced German intelligence that Normandy was merely a feint, preceding the main assault at Pas de Calais, as referenced in the official U.S. Army history by Gordon Harrison. The technological innovations employed on D-Day, from D-Day swimming tanks to specialized engineering vehicles, had proven their worth. Under the ultimate test of combat conditions, the human factor proved equally decisive. From Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s instant decision to start the war from right here at Utah Beach, to the countless acts of individual courage that turned the tide at Omaha, D-Day succeeded because ordinary soldiers rose to extraordinary circumstances. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers had taken initiative when communications failed and plans collapsed, demonstrating the superior training and leadership development of the Allied forces. The airborne assault, despite its apparent chaos, had achieved its strategic purpose of disrupting German communications and preventing coordinated counterattacks. The scattered paratroopers had created confusion throughout the German rear areas, making it impossible for defenders to concentrate their forces effectively against the beach landings. As Allied forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the breakout battles that would follow, the German high command finally began to grasp the magnitude of their defeat. The Atlantic Wall, into which they had poured millions of tons of concrete and steel, had been breached in a single day. The fortress of Nazi Europe now had a crack in its western wall that would widen into the highway of liberation. D-Day had succeeded because courage, planning, technology, and luck had combined at the decisive moment of the Second World War.